just start to record. Before we start, I would like to express my acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the land on which I work and live, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Let's start with an introduction of our presenter, Dr. Yvonne Scorgie, who is Senior Team Leader at New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. Yvonne is a science leader within the public service focused on integrating climate, energy, air quality, and health research to support evidence-based policies which deliver positive outcomes for communities and the environment. In her current role, Yvonne leads greenhouse gas emission pathways modeling to inform the state's actions towards achieving net zero emissions by 2050. Thank you very much, Yvonne. The stage is all yours.
Thanks very much. Apologies for coming in late. I just wanted to say that there's another link to a Zoom meeting in the meeting invitation, and Inga is on there. So
okay,
it might cause a bit of confusion. I just wanted to tell you that there is another link. So I went in with the one in the brochure now and managed to get into this meeting. So there's someone else holding on out there. But I'll just continue. I'll just share my screen. So are people able to see my screen?
Yes, that's good. That's good.
Okay, so thanks for the opportunity to speak with you. I'm going to be talking about air quality and health benefits of transitioning to clean energy. Are people able to see my slides? Can you just nod if you're able to? Oh, excellent. Thanks, Michael. I'd just like to acknowledge my colleagues within the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, and there's a growing list of them as we expand our work in this area. We also worked in collaboration with Dr. Richard Broome from the Ministry of Health, and also Jeff Morgan and Ben Jalaluddin from CAR. Our modeling, we don't do market modeling for the electricity sector in-house. So we used a company called Frontier Economics, who have expertise in that area. So in the talk, I'm going to give a brief overview of the context, talking about air quality in Sydney, but also looking at the policy context. And since the last time I gave a similar presentation a couple of months ago, there's been some substantial movements in the policy space, I realized. I'm going to be focusing on looking at air quality and health benefits of coal-fired power generation in New South Wales, with a focus on Greater Sydney, and then also give you some insight into some of our future directions. So New South Wales has got an extensive air quality monitoring network that our department operates, with over 90 monitoring stations, including in metropolitan, rural and regional areas. And that's, if you think about the New South Wales population, we've got 8 million people living in the country, with almost 5 million of those living within the Greater Sydney basin. So 80% of the time, our air quality is good or very good. So by international standards, it's relatively good. So when we do get air pollution events, as many of you know, it's normally associated with particle pollution, and sometimes in the Greater Sydney basin, we also get photochemical ozone episodes. I wouldn't do justice to a presentation on air quality and health if I didn't make mention of the atypical bushfire season that we had in 2019-20, where we had substantial area burnt. We had about 5.5 million hectares of land burnt with smoke, bushfire smoke, and also dust impacts across the state. And during this period, we had 30 to 50% of the spring and summertime. We had days exceeding air quality standards. So Borchers et al. Estimated that the attributable deaths due to that, what we call the Black Summer bushfire smoke episode in New South Wales, resulted in 219 attributable deaths in New South Wales. So, but stepping back from that, acknowledging that these very dry, hot, bushfire-prone years are driving additional deaths. If we step back and we think about the more typical years in between those years, why are we concerned about looking at air pollution, and particularly within the context of clean energy? And the reason really is that we know that despite the fact that the air quality is really relatively good by world standards, that there are still a significant number of deaths associated with chronic exposure to air pollution. And Richard Broom et al. Estimated the attributable deaths due to anthropogenic air pollution in the Greater Sydney area to be about 420 each year. And in the recently released Clean Air Strategy, released as a draft for consultation, the annual health costs associated with those 420 premature deaths are reported to be $3.3 billion. So clearly there's a health and an economic reason why we would look at clean energy. So looking at the policy context, and as I mentioned, it really is an expanding space in regards to clean energy. We started in 2016 with New South Wales government releasing our climate change policy framework, which really set out our objective to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and to make the state more resilient to a changing climate. At that time, we started getting requests from our colleagues working in the clean energy and energy efficiency space, asking us about what are the air quality and health co-benefits that are likely to result from clean energy actions. And the rationale was that they wanted to take those benefits into account when they did cost-benefit analysis for energy policies. Since then, we've seen the New South Wales government has released in 2019 the electricity strategy, which really paves the way for more reliable, affordable, and sustainable electricity, including renewables and the firming of those renewables. We saw in March last year, we released our net zero plan, which is really the first stage of our transition to net zero. So putting in place the policies and programs that will address not only the electricity sector, but also the non-electricity sector across the economy. More recently, late last year, we released the electricity infrastructure roadmap, which really sets out the government's plan for paving the way for a really modern electricity system, in the light of the fact that 4 of our 5 coal-fired power stations will go offline in the next 15 years. Just last week, we released the Clean Air Strategy draft for consultation, and this leans quite heavily on some of these other policy levers. to realise air quality and health benefits. So if you haven't had a look at that yet, I would strongly suggest do a read of that. Transport for New South Wales also just recently released the Future Energy Strategy and the associated action plan, really talking about how transport are wanting to lead the transition of New South Wales transport, and that includes electrification of buses to, also increasing the level of ambition for the New South Wales government fleet and paving the way for electric vehicles and so on. So I'll step back and say I'm going to be talking to you a little bit more about the Clean Energy Co-Benefit Study. The work was started in about 2017 and stretched to about 2019. And since then, we've been implementing the outcomes in the study within our policies, supporting, as I mentioned, those other documents. And our work is referenced, for instance, in the electricity infrastructure roadmap documentation. So this study, we looked at assessing the air quality impacts and associated health burden of coal-fired power station emissions in New South Wales, and really wanted to quantify the air quality improvements and associated health benefits of reducing coal-fired power generation by implementing demand management, so through energy efficiency and clean energy actions. The important thing to think about is currently coal-fired power generation accounts for 80% of New South Wales electricity generation. And that generation is really accounting for 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So this sector is particularly important from both a net zero and a clean air perspective. The map on the right-hand side shows you the coal-fired power stations that were in operation for our base year. We used 2013 as a base case year for assessing the health burden due to existing coal-fired power generation. The rationale for using that year is because it coincided with a very extensive emissions inventory that the EPA had prepared and published. And at that time, we had 7 coal-fired power stations. Since then, Wallawong on the other side of the Blue Mountains and Red Bank have closed, leaving Bayswater and Liddell power stations in the Upper Hunter, Eraring and Bales Point in the Lower Hunter, and Mount Piper inland. So looking at greenhouse gas emissions is quite interesting. Emissions from power generation actually increased from the 1990s, onwards, peaked in about 2008-9, and then started declining. If we look at the sort of long-term average emissions, it's about 53 million tonnes in 2013. The annual emissions during that year were about 52 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. On the map, the yellow dots are where we had monitoring stations at that time during 2013. So our method overview, we apply full pathway assessments. So we start by looking at energy generation modelling, including forecasting what the business as usual generation would look like into the future, and then perturbing that counterfactual with energy action policy scenarios. We do emissions modelling, and that feeds into our chemical transport modelling so that we can understand the contribution of power stations to particle pollution, including secondary and primary particle pollution. We validated the model based on 2013, the 2013 base case. We then do population exposure, so overlaying modeled air pollution concentrations over population to get a population weighted exposure. And do a health impact assessment and calculate damage costs. And ultimately, what goes into the cost benefit analysis is really the damage costs. So all of the work is really to deliver those numbers. So for the baseline energy generation, Frontiers did this work, and they really foresighted what the generation by each coal-fired power station is likely to look like into the future, given business as usual, and taking into account sort of the announced retirement. So we can see Liddell Power Station coming out in 2022 and Bayswater in 2035. On the basis of that BAU, or in addition to that BAU, they also said, well, what if we introduce some energy efficiency or clean energy measures? And what we did is we looked at two scenarios. We looked at a medium demand shock and a large demand shock. So introducing additional wind and solar PV, energy efficiency and large solar. The reason why we did a medium and a large demand shock was we wanted to see if it changed, if there was some non-linearity in the electricity system, such that if we increased the reduction in demand, would it increase the amount of coal-fired power generation that was taken out, or reduce it proportionally. So what happens, of course, is when you reduce electricity, the most expensive power stations reduce their generation first. So we tend to reduce gas-fired power first before we offset coal-fired generation. So in terms of the energy generation outlook modelling, we had a baseline shown in the blue line there, where we were modelled coal-fired power station output for business as usual, and then the reduction associated with the electricity demand reduction scenarios. For the emissions modelling, so this is showing you sulfur dioxide emissions from each of the power stations. That was resolved on an hourly basis for each and every power station to support the baseline modelling. For the energy actions, we then looked at what the reduction in sulfur dioxide and other emissions would be from each of the power stations. Again, that was resolved, the modelling done out to 2045 and done for the two demand shock scenarios. For the chemical transport modelling, we use the CSIRO's models, or we did for this exercise, we used the CCAM meteorological model using era interim data as input, and used CSIRO's chemical transport model to predict the air pollution concentrations. Notably here, we modelled all sources. So for the 2013 base year, we modelled all sources, including coal-fired power generation and excluding it, so that we could work out the difference. For the future years, we held other sources of emission constant, so both natural and anthropogenic, and just perturbed the coal-fired power generation. We did model validation to assess the performance. We did this for 2013, as I mentioned, and we found that the model bias error and correlation were within acceptable benchmarks for similar policy applications. I've got some statistics on the screen there. Basically, without going into too much detail, I wanted to show you some of the results for sulfur dioxide, for instance. So if you look at the graph on the top left-hand side, you'll see sort of observations in blue compared to model results in red on an hourly basis. And what we're really trying to do for SO2 is really good because the sort of smoking gun of power station emissions. Coal-fired power generation accounts for 87% of SO2 emissions in the greater metro area. So if we get the SO2 right, it's more likely that we're going to get the other pollutants right. And we are for Musselbrook, which is located in the Upper Hunter, close to Bayswater and Liddell. We were predicting when the plume strikes were really occurring at that station. Maybe not getting the complete magnitude of the peak, but certainly fairly consistently getting the pattern right, and that showed in the annual average concentrations as well. For the future years, we modelled snapshot years because of the computational intensity of the modelling. It's not possible to model every year, so we modelled 3 breakpoint years: 2020, indicative of when Liddell is still in operation; 2028, when we've still got Bayswater in operation, but Liddell has come offline; and 2039, indicative of the latter period where both Liddell and Bayswater have concluded their operations. This shows some of the results for the large demand shock for 2020 and the 2039 break years, and you can just see the reduction in 2020, a reduction not due to power stations coming offline, but due to the reduction in generation due to reduced demand. 2039, we see a substantial reduction around the in the Lower Hunter. So the health impact assessment method, we focused on mortality and exposure particularly to fine particles or particulate matter less than 2.5 in aerodynamic diameter. To characterize long-term exposure, we used an annual average for 2013 when we looked at health burden, and we assumed that was indicative of sort of longer-term exposures. We used the Institute of Occupational Medicine's life table spreadsheet system to help the calculations. We modified that system slightly to take into account sort of more resolved age data in the 85 years and up, and also to take into account New South Wales health data, which includes neonatal deaths. We, as an input into the assessment, we used health and population data from New South Wales Health, which includes age, year specific counts of population and all-cause mortality rates, and we did the mortality on over a 3-year rolling aggregate for privacy reasons. So the health burden estimates were done for 3 metrics. We looked at the attributable number of premature deaths, the loss of life expectancy at birth, years of life lost, and for health benefit, we looked at the life years gained. So for the exposure assessment, this is just an indicator, just graphically representing what we did, modeled annual average PM2.5 concentrations, overlaid over the ABS 1 kilometre gridded resident population, and then calculated the weighted average. For looking at the health benefits, obviously we were looking at the change in annual average PM2.5 concentrations and the change in exposure. Health burden and benefits, so we modelled it based on an impact factor, taking into account the change in in population weighted annual average PM2.5 concentrations. For health burden, we were looking, of course, at the change in exposure with and without coal-fired power generation, and for the health benefits associated with the energy actions, we were looking at the energy action scenario compared to the counterfactual. We used concentration response coefficients, a concentration response coefficient adapted from Hook et al. We then used the impact factor to calculate the attributable number of premature deaths, taking into account the age group specific mortality rates and the age group specific population, and then aggregating overall age groups. Years of life lost. So that's basically just looking at the number of years lost by people that have died in 2013 as a result of the exposure to fine particles attributable to the power stations, and that was done again on an age specific basis, and then summed with the life years lost basically being the change in life expectancy multiplied by the attributable number of deaths in that age range. For health benefits, we looked at life years gained using the life table approach. We modified, as I mentioned, the IOM's life table spreadsheet. We did the calculations over 106 years, by which time the majority of those alive in the baseline year would have died. And again, just looking at the change in life expectancy due as a result of the reduction in exposure due to energy action. So monetizing the health outcomes, and clearly here we focused the health impact assessment on mortality, all-cause mortality outcomes. So it didn't then cost any of the or quantify any of the morbidity due to exposure. To monetize the attributable number of deaths and the life years lost and gained, we used the value of a statistical life and the value of a statistical life year, which is really the value, the economic value placed on society's willingness to pay to avoid those deaths. We spent quite a lot of time looking at the literature, looking at different VSLs, and settled on one that's been most widely used for health and air quality studies locally, and that's the one published by Access Economics. So 7.85 million per life. It's about 8 or just over 8 million in today's dollars, and then derived the VSLY based on that. In terms of the damage costs, we expressed the damage cost slightly differently. So when we were talking about health burden, we expressed the health costs in terms of the dollars of health costs per megawatt hour of coal-fired power generation, whereas when we were looking at health benefits, we expressed it in terms of the megawatt hours of total electricity generation avoided. So that's just because that's the way in which we used it in the cost benefit analysis. So for the health burden, here's some of the assumptions. I mentioned the CRF that we used already. We used a discount rate of 7%. We didn't use any cessation lag, and we used the VSL of 7.85 million. We also did sensitivity analysis looking at a higher concentration response coefficient, looking at 3% and 10% discount rates, which is required by New South Wales Treasury, and looking at higher and lower VSLs. For the benefit assumptions, we had a number of different scenarios just to do some testing. We looked at medium and large demand shocks for 2 time horizons, so including the sort of ramp up of those measures and excluding the ramp up of measures just when the measures were in place. And the other factors are more or less the same as for the health burden. We did, however, so I think we did some testing with and without cessation lag as well. And for the testing with, we used the US EPA's 20-year structure, where they basically assume only 30% of the impacts are experienced in the first year, another 50% in the next 2 to 5 years, and the remaining after that. So it's just delaying the effects. So looking at the health burden and costs, this shows the central estimates where we were getting an attributable number of deaths in the order of 31 associated with long-term exposure to coal-fired power stations, and we estimated about 400 years of life lost. And so if we look at the monetary value associated with that, we're looking at about $247 million based on the attributable number of deaths, and years of life lost about 225. I might just mention here, when we came to doing this study, there was a lot of discussion about the methodology that should be used for this, whether we should go with years of life lost or stay with the attributable number, and so on. And so part of the study was actually looking at how material the methodology would be. And you can see, looking at the monetary value, it's not making that much of a difference. What makes a difference is, of course, what you assume by way of the concentration response coefficient and the discount rates. So looking at the damage costs, and I might just mention, up until this point, our energy colleagues had been using damage costs from the literature that were derived from studies done in Europe and elsewhere. And I think at the time they were using something like $14 or $16 per megawatt hour. So the study sort of reduced down the potential health burden, but gave more robust local numbers on which to base their cost benefit analysis. So if we look at the central estimate, we're saying, around about $4 per megawatt hour of energy generated. That's the order of magnitude of the damage costs. For the health benefits, we looked at those 2 scenarios, so medium demand and large demand, quantified the life years gained, and looked at the associated health costs. I mean, the interesting thing was that, there seemed to be more linearity in the electricity generation modeling than what we assumed, because the large demand was almost just double in terms of the health benefits. Had we known that when we started the study, we could have reduced a substantial amount of the effort. So looking at the damage costs for health benefits, so these are the numbers that get really picked up and included in the CBAs for energy efficiency and clean energy actions. the central estimate there is, around about $2, $2.50 per megawatt hour of avoided generation. And although it looks small, when you use it in policy work, it comes out to be material for many of our actions. So what I want to do now is just look forward a little bit. So that's sort of the studies that have been done, where our electricity sector is heading going forwards, is going to look substantially different. So we saw even under the base case during the study that we were doing, you saw the drop-off of coal-fired power generation and associated drop-off of emissions. The estimates from the Australian Energy Market Operator is that we're going to have 82% of the renewable energy renewable energy is going to account for 82% of New South Wales electricity supply by 2036. And what you see here is really the already announced exits of many of the coal-fired power stations. And as I mentioned, 4 of the 5 coal-fired power stations will end operations in the next 15 years. So it'll only be Mount Piper that will still be in operation after 2037. So AEMO was really, those projections predate the New South Wales electricity infrastructure roadmap released in November last year, and the enabling electricity investment infrastructure act that was promulgated in December. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about the implications of that. And as I mentioned, this is really recent. This is, what's happened since December, literally. So with the publication of the electricity infrastructure roadmap, and what I'm showing here is some of the modelling that's available in the detailed report of that roadmap. They were looking at potentially that the infrastructure safeguard could deliver about 12 gigawatts of additional generation capacity by 2030 compared to business as usual. And that coming from an economics perspective, most likely from onshore wind, large-scale solar, and dispatchable storage. The estimate based on that modelling is that we would reduce greenhouse gas emissions cumulatively over the years to 2030 by about 90 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. An associated publication that published with the electricity infrastructure roadmap, but done by KPMG together with the New South Wales Office of the Chief Scientist, was looking at industry opportunities that's really enabled by making available cheap, clean, and reliable electricity. Last week, we also announced that our minister announced the Net Zero Industry and Innovation Program that really looks at how we harness, cleaner energy to really not only electrify industry, but also open up opportunities for green steel, ammonia, green aluminium, and cleaner transport. So looking at transport, and this is where really our focus is at the moment. So on the left-hand side there, you see some of the PM 2.5 modelling that has been done under our Sydney Air Quality study, looking at annual average PM 2.5 concentrations from on-road vehicles and off-road and diesel and marine vehicles. And if we look at the contribution of on and off-road transport and including marine to population weighted annual average PM2.5, we see that it's responsible for about 25% of anthropogenic air pollution. So if you think of that $3.3 billion, about 800 million of that we're associating with transport. If you look at the graphs on the right-hand side, you'll see that from a greenhouse gas perspective, transport emissions have been growing without stop really since 1990, with current transport emissions more than 50% higher than what they were in 1990, and contributing substantially to New South Wales' current greenhouse gas emissions. Unlike electricity generation, where greenhouse gas emissions are projected to fall off quite significantly towards 2030, transport under business as usual is projected to continue growing, both in absolute terms and in terms of its contribution to New South Wales emissions. So transport is a focus for us. We've been looking in more detail at the health burden associated with New South Wales road transport, doing fleet emissions, health impact modelling to go into CBAs. And under the Net Zero plan, we have an electric vehicle infrastructure and model availability program. And to inform the design of that program, we've been doing EV uptake and benefits modelling. If we look at BAU in terms of electric vehicles, we will only have about 26 to 30% of new vehicles being electric vehicles by 2030. And if you look at the proportion of electric vehicles in the stock, of course, it's much lower than that. So this modelling, we've been building an EV uptake model to understand what level of incentives would be required to really get, in this case, private sector fleets to uptake additional vehicles, and what the implications of that would be in terms of not only reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, but also air quality and health benefits. So just in conclusion, really, we've, based on our studies and also the review of the literature, we know that air quality and health benefits of moving to cleaner energy generation are material and should be taken into account when motivating for and doing cost benefit analysis for cleaner generation and energy efficiency projects. We've got research ongoing into the air quality and health benefits of electrifying road transport and industry, and also looking at the broader benefits of industry opportunities opened up through clean, cheap and reliable energy. Under our Sydney Air Quality Study, which is a multi-year study and ongoing, it's looking at future air quality exposure and health impacts. And really, we're starting to pay more attention to the potential for emerging issues associated with clean energy and the net zero transition. A critical sort of intersect between greenhouse gas mitigation policy and clean air policy is really the making sure that the programs and policies under the net zero plan are looking to maximize the air quality and health benefits, and that we're really using the transition to net zero and cleaner energy in the best possible way to drive health benefits. So really our work is looking to continue working at this interface, integrating climate, energy, air quality and health research. So I might just stop there and ask if there are any questions. Apologies if I rushed a little bit. I wanted to leave at least 10 minutes for questions.
Okay. Yes. No, thank you. Thank you, Yvonne. Very interesting presentation. Yes, here, please feel free to type your questions in the chat box or just open your mics to ask your questions. Here we have a question from Ingo. So Ingo, do you like to open your mic and ask your question, please?
Sorry, just had to find my mic. Yeah, the question was, the graph showed that there was obviously a high greenhouse gas emissions from heavy vehicles and also rail. And there's a bit of focus there on electric vehicles, which we know is pretty well the dominant way that the average motor vehicle is heading. But what about hydrogen? There seems to be a lot of interest in hydrogen at the moment amongst the heavy vehicle industry to incorporate even hybrid type of systems. Is that something that's being supported by the government in addition to EVs?
So hydrogen is definitely a focus area, and we have hydrogen as so I mentioned the New South Wales Industry Innovation Program that was launched last week. That's got integrated within that is a hydrogen stream. So we also announced sort of the hydrogen hub for the Hunter last week, and I think that there will be more announcements in the hydrogen space. So to answer your question, Ingo, we have definitely been looking at both hydrogen and electric vehicles for the heavy duty fleet, and certainly hydrogen has got a significant role to play for large passenger vehicles as well, but also for heavy duty vehicles. So definitely work we are doing.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And another question is from Jeff. Jeff, would you like to open your mic and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Yvonne. That was incredibly impressive scope of work that DeepI and your group's taking on. It's reassuring. And just in terms of the health impact assessment work, what in your view are the sort of lessons from incorporating the health benefits component into the sort of vast amount of work you've done in the background, the example being electricity generation and policy change to electricity generation. And what are the lessons for the future for doing that sort of health impact assessment for policy transitions?
Well, I think it's incredibly important work, Jeff. And can I just acknowledge, your work with us, because honestly, without your work and Richard Brune's work and Gel's work, we wouldn't have got where we got. So just acknowledging the really important role you played. So I can say this work is critically important. In the first instance, from a pure bottom line perspective, it really is material when they do cost benefit analysis. I'm on a daily basis, I'm involved in these type of analysis for new actions, and it makes a material difference to have the health benefits costed and in there. And we really need to pay attention to that. And it is making a difference for electric vehicles as well. So we absolutely have to have it in there. The second thing is, in terms of communicating and getting, social buy-in for actions, it's also really important to not only talk about greenhouse gas emissions, but to actually talk about air quality and health benefits. So I think it really sells action. People can identify much more with those type of impacts.
And just briefly, sorry to follow up, but would you do anything different with the health angle next time?
I think we did a lot of discovery. We went down a lot of rabbit holes, which I might not go down next time. If I just think of the sheer amount of time that we spent on sensitivity analysis and, you know, looking at different, you know, looking at, look, I think it was worthwhile going through it to know what, you know, what's substantive and not, but I would streamline it and keep my eye on the big ticket items. So, so for instance, I'll give you an example. You know, the value of a statistical life. I can tell you, I lost 3 months of my life, you know, worrying about what DSL to use. You know, I just don't want to go there again. You know?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that, Yvonne.
Okay. Thank you. The other question is from Michael. Michael, would you like to ask your question, please?
Thanks, Marsan, and thanks so much, Yvonne. That was a great presentation. Some of us epidemiologists are a bit squeamish about the value of a statistical life as well. Now, my feeling is that there's basically policy paralysis at a Commonwealth level. So maybe New South Wales is the national leader. I just wonder whether you could tell us whether there are any similar analyses underway in any other states.
So I know that Victoria are looking at externalities. So so that's definitely one state that is doing this type of work, and they work closely with both CAR and with CSIRO on this. I think in terms of federal policy, might I just say that the net zero plan, so sitting behind the net zero plan is really $2 billion worth of funding for programs. And $1 billion of that comes from the Fed. So, so behind the scenes, there is significant investment in this transition from the federal government.
That's very good to know. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And Christine, I can see you have a question. Would you like to open your mic, Christine?
Hi, Yvonne, thanks so much for the presentation. It was amazing, and obviously an incredible amount of work that you and your team have been doing. I'm really interested in the EV transition work that you're partly focusing on now. I mean, look, I've heard but not looked into previous EV transition work. I'm not even sure who did it. It might have been an organisation like the NRMA, but I'm not sure, that seemed to indicate that the benefits wouldn't be as great as what people were thinking they might be because of brake and tyre wear, still generating PM aerosols and so on. But I think there's a lot of EVs now are starting to use regenerative braking, so you don't actually in one pedal driving, and presumably you don't wear out the brake pads as much. I mean, are things, I guess, the details like that being considered in your work?
So we definitely look. I mean, when we look at emission reductions due to electric vehicles, obviously we do take the non-exhaust component, a brake and tyre wear, into account. I mean, we probably are, overestimating because we're not. We're assuming that the emissions will be similar for electric vehicles, so not really taking regenerative braking into account. But if I can refer you to sort of Richard Broom's paper, where they did quantify the health burden due to exhaust and non-exhaust. So we were getting about 25% of population weighted annual average PM2.5 being due to on and off road transport. they were getting about 28%. And of that 28%, only about 5% was associated with non-exhaust. So the exhaust component is, a significant contributor to the health burden. But you're quite right, we can't ignore the non-exhaust component.
So, I mean, does that mean that the non-exhaust component has been overestimated by some groups in the past, or?
I think the important thing is that some people look at emissions as an indication. And I think in terms of emissions, you're only looking at primary particles in the first instance. And you're not looking at the secondary particle component associated with combustion emissions. So I just know when you look at the emissions compared to when you look at contributions to fine particle concentrations in the air, there is a difference.
Thanks.
And sorry, it's Jeff here. Could I just add one last bit to that? Is that the other thing, what you're saying there, Yvonne, is totally true. That if you just focus on emissions, you can underestimate it because in terms of the total of emissions, motor vehicles have a particular value. But the thing is, those emissions happen really close to where people are.
Yeah.
And so the population weighted exposure is actually relatively high. So it depends on what angle you take when you look at it a bit.
I mean, a lot of the questions that we're getting at the moment is, we're having these discussions about what's the level of exposure of, 1 ton of emissions emitted at street level compared to a ton of emissions from a power station. So those are the types of discussions that we are having with the public actually at the moment, which is quite interesting.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today here. We're going to close the session, and I also would like to thank Yvonne for accepting our invitation and for this great presentation. Thank you, and I wish you all a great weekend ahead. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye.